Archbishop Peter Comensoli was earlier this month installed as the 9th Catholic Archbishop of Melbourne. He was formerly the Bishop of Broken Bay, which takes in the beautiful northern beaches of Sydney and parts of the New South Wales Central Coast. We're just discussing how lovely it is up there. And before that, he held senior positions in the Archdiocese of Sydney. Bishop Comensoli grew up in Wollongong, south of Sydney, where before joining the church, he worked as a bank teller. He could be a bank chief executive now instead of an archbishop. I don't know which job's more controversial. He loved surfing and rugby league, and as he told our friend Neil Mitchell the other day, he was a bit of a bogan in Wollongong, and happily so. In fact, Bishop Comensoli comes to Melbourne with pretty much little connection to the city at all. He'd only been here, I think, 3 times before he got the tap to become Archbishop. And I have to say, in all honesty, you have not made your transition to the city any easier, Archbishop, by choosing Essendon as your football team. Of all the teams, I think it's got something to do with redemption. Other than living that down, Bishop Comensoli, of course, as we all know, faces lots of challenges. There's the school funding dispute with the now Morrison government and the new, albeit Catholic, Education Minister, Dan Tehan. And of course, as we all know, Archbishop Peter Comensoli has the task of trying to rebuild trust in the Catholic Church after the absolutely disgraceful way the Church has acted in regards to child abuse and not making sure it didn't happen many years ago, and in fact until fairly recently. So I think on that front he's got his work cut out for him. Archbishop Peter Comensoli is going to speak for 20 minutes or so. He is more than happy to take your questions. Please, questions, no statements. And I'd also like to note at the Press Club we do always welcome robust, frank conversation, but we'd also like respectful conversation as well. Ladies and gentlemen, please give a very warm Melbourne welcome to Archbishop Peter Comensoli.
Thank you, Michael. That's twice you've now said warm Melbourne welcome, which I'm glad. The human way of living in Melbourne is warm, at least. The physical way, not necessarily so. So, friends, it's good to be here amongst you, as I said earlier on. Now, if we count Kevin Rudd twice, Australia has had 31 Prime Ministers over the last 117 years. By comparison, and perhaps a little unfairly, I'm only number 9 of the line of Archbishops of Melbourne over the past 170 years. So my predecessors have averaged around 20 years in the role, and if I get to retirement at 75, I'll be in the chair for 21 years. So to borrow a racing term, we Archbishops of Melbourne do seem to be stayers rather than sprinters. The Catholic Church has always taken something of the long view of the world. Our principal source for the future, for example, was determined in the 1st century AD in the Christian Bible. And our current key interpretive tool was settled in the mid-1960s at the Second Vatican Council. So the idea of long-term in the Catholic Church is really important, and certainly not determined by the length of the forward estimates. And given that my own appointment has not been by popular vote, though I suspect some wish it was, I am already conscious that I will need to pace myself over the marathon ahead. Why the long haul? I think it's an important question, and one that might help you. Well, first and foremost, bishops are meant to be like fathers to God's people, faithful stewards of God's grace. As you know, fathers don't own their children. Rather, they are granted the immense privilege of shepherding them through to adulthood. This takes time. Being a father is not a short-term calling. And being a bishop is not a job. I'm meant to be in this for the long haul. And the long haul actually matters. Of course, the measure of a parent can end up being good, bad, or indifferent. And time will tell how I fare in that regard. Those of you who are parents will know that the whole of your life, and hopefully not some single moment in it, will be the true measure of your parenting. I readily acknowledge that the manner in which I commence as Archbishop, what I say, what I do, will be of some considerable significance. But I'm likely to be in this role well after most of you have moved on from your professions. And I certainly will be in the role a lot longer than the 31st Prime Minister of Australia. So the manner in which I finish in around 2040 will inevitably be different. Then may the measure of my life be taken. If being a parent captures something of how I am to be a bishop, then what is it that I am to do? A bishop takes his cues in this regard directly from the life of Jesus Christ. Jesus was sent by his Father as a priest, prophet, and king to the world. So, in turn, I am to sanctify, teach, and govern in all of the faithful in the image of Jesus. That sanctifying task, to sanctify, is one of bringing people into a personal relationship with God. And we call this holiness. The teaching task is one of communicating the good news of the gospel. And this we call proclaiming the gospel. And the governing task is one of leading God's people in faith, hope, and love. And we call this shepherding. So that kind of sums up what I am supposed to be about. A priest, prophet, and king who sanctifies, teaches, and governs by proclaiming and shepherding God's people in holiness. Here's a bit of a definition. I thought it worthwhile giving you just that little bit of theology to help stress a particular point. I am not a minister of a government, nor am I a corporate CEO. I am a bishop, meant to be a successor of the apostles. I'm not meant to be a man of the world, but a man of God in the world. This forms the way I hear and see things. It shapes the way I think and speak. It moulds the way I discern and act. Some call bishops a sign of contradiction. I think I prefer to think of myself as doing life a little differently. As a leader in the Catholic Church, I will always see the world from a particular perspective. Mine is a view from a cross on Calvary, which explains the motto that I've had for a number of years, which comes from St. Paul's first letter to the Corinthians. We proclaim a crucified Christ. That shapes how I see the world and how I engage with others. Your own vista, whatever it might be, will likewise shape you. It's not that we live in different worlds, but we might see it from different horizons. So, when I look out in these last couple of weeks at the church in Melbourne, what do I see? Well, first and foremost, I see a people, God's people. In our church language, We call God's people the body of Christ because each member of the church is united in some way to Jesus Christ. This is a more personal and ecological way of seeing the church, which is quite different from the more organisational and institutional image in which society more generally views things. Another thing I see is, for all sorts of historical reasons, much of the language associated with the church has become less personal and more institutional. The church has become a building and what happens in it. The work of priests has become more managerial in word and deed. The language of honour has morphed into an attitude of entitlement. We have become big in stature, arguably at the cost of a humbleness in disposition. Though we need accountable structures to proclaim the gospel, the church is not an institution. Though we strive to do good things, the church is not an NGO. Though we have things of beauty to show, the church is not a museum. Such images do not sit well with the gospel, and they don't look much like Jesus. So, my own hope, and something of the broader vision that I have, is that we might recover a more domestic, familial language in what we say and do as the church, and to let go of the more corporate, managerial image we have perhaps come to adopt. The third thing I see is the enormous diversity that comprises the church in Melbourne. We have 208 parishes and 328 schools. We touch people's lives in faith, education, health, aged care, welfare, housing, safeguarding, charity, justice, ecology, marriage, family, youth, prayer groups, apostolic works, religious communities, academic life, adult faith formation, music and the arts, and so on. We partner with governments and businesses and community groups for the common good of all. So the variety in the life of the church is as wide and as deep as human life. So contrary to popular opinion, the church is not actually some monolithic block, though it can certainly appear to be. Rather, she is enormously diverse and open to a multiplicity of forms and foci and structures. We are at our worst when we try to constrain this diversity into controlling centres of power. We are at our best when God's people can expand their wings, so to speak, under the supporting wind of the Holy Spirit. Just as there are many ways of being a family, so too with the family of the church. Which brings me to one final thing I'd like to share with you about how I see the church in Melbourne. While I accept that people often see the church institutionally, and members of the church, particularly its leadership, have ourselves contributed to this, the image of the church as a family is the more honest image. And I want to suggest that the devastation of clerical sexual abuse reveals why this is the case. It can seem all too easy for me to say that these horrendous crimes have utterly broken the lives of so many of God's people. Rightly, people have called out the failure of the church as an institution in this regard. It is striking, however, that this whole tragedy has been felt most intensely in family-like ways. The abuser has been someone trusted. The victim often knew their perpetrator as a kind of an extended family member. As a survivor, they were shattered further when church leaders failed to believe them. Families and the wider faith community have felt all of this personally. They carry deep wounds of grief and anger at this profoundly shameful past and demand justice, healing and change, not just an apology. Indeed. Yet, people still want to say, I am a Catholic Christian, and no monstrous perpetrator or compromised leader will take Jesus from me. We don't say things like that about corporate institutions. But such words are spoken by many who belong to the family of the church. And their voices cry out to be heard within the circle of their faith family. As St. Paul puts it, if one member suffers, all suffer together with it. Personally, I find this deeply humbling and a sharp reminder that the life of faith is not mine to control. That life, in all its griefs and sorrows, as well as all its joys and hopes, belongs to all God's people who seek to be united in Jesus Christ. Thanks. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Archbishop. Now it's time for questions and answers. I'll start with working journalists first, but I'm very keen, of course, to open up the floor in the remaining 40 minutes or so to as many of you as possible. So, I should, yes, failure number one. There'll be lots of questions. In fact, I'll use the MC prerogative here to start. It's great to hear you acknowledge the failure of the church in dealing with predator priests and the appalling impact they've had not just on families but on local communities. The Royal Commission had some, I think, fantastic suggestions to help make up for that, including breaking down the seal of the confession to enforce mandatory reporting of people who confess to horrendous crimes, and secondly, making celibacy optional in the Catholic Church. Where do you stand on both of those?
The celibacy one I'll take first. It's a little easier to work through the issues on that one. More generally, the issues of what to do in terms of breaking down what is behind all of that is to consider where we are in terms of sexual maturity and how we are working with our young men who are wanting to be formed into the priesthood, and also those who are currently in the priesthood in terms of that. So as you'd be aware, the scourge of sexual abuse has been particular in the Catholic Church, but it's certainly not isolated to the Catholic Church. And so the questions of how people generally are living out their sexual lives is important in this regard. It's not the only issue, but it is important. And so I see the question of celibacy in that context. Not to find people who are experts in celibacy as such, but people who are experts, well-formed in their own sexual maturity. So some of the tasks that are important in that regard is the sort of training that we provide, the human training that we provide in seminary contexts. I've already started the process of finding ways in which the young fellows who are training in our seminary at the moment might be engaged in parish communities, in local situations where they're with ordinary people and not in some isolated reality, but with ordinary people learning how to live ordinarily their sexual lives. The question of whether celibacy or not should be made mandatory or not, my own position is that I think celibacy is a good thing. It offers a pathway within the life of the church. It's not for everyone, but it is for some. And so that's what I'd say with the celibacy side. On the confession question, it'd be no surprise to everyone here that I uphold the seal of the confession, but I uphold mandatory reporting as well. So there's two principles that are sitting side by side there. I've been practicing mandatory reporting. Coming from New South Wales, we've had mandatory reporting, or here it's called reportable conduct scheme. But I'm sort of learning new language, different state, different language. I've been doing this for nearly 10 years and I've also exercised my responsibilities already here in Victoria in that regard. So I uphold mandatory reporting. I support mandatory reporting, and that particular recommendation from the Royal Commission, which was also a recommendation that came out of the Victorian Parliamentary Inquiry, I believe, as well. Still learning a little bit about that one. I fully support. The principle of the seal of confession is a different question, I believe. Now, I know that's not what a lot of people think, but it has a different reality to it. And I think one of the most important things in all of this is that the practicalities of winding back the seal of confession is, I think, something that can't be easily done. Not that the seal itself is the question here, it's the practicalities. I think there's not a good understanding of what actually happens within the context of a confession in its ritual structure. And the fact that I've been hearing confessions now for 26, nearly 27 years, the vast majority of those people that I've heard, and there'd be thousands of them by now, I would have no clue who they are. In a practical term, just as a practical thing, not the theory or the concept, but as a practical thing, do we start asking people to provide photo IDs before they come in? Because it would have to happen before they come in to the confessional, because you don't know what's going to be said until you're in there. So how do you determine who you know? And so it's just a practical dimension to that. The concept, though, I think provides the possibilities of offering pathways for children towards getting the help that they and the protection that they need, and it also provides some pathways for people who would otherwise not mention this to anyone to be challenged, perpetrators I'm talking about, to be challenged to take steps to present themselves to the authorities and to seek the right sort of overcoming of their great crimes and evils.
And punishment. Yes, stay there, please. Yes, over there.
Ben Schneider's from The Age.
Sorry?
Ben.
Speak up a bit, Ben.
Yeah,
Hello,
sorry.
hello,
Yeah.
Ben.
Hi, how you doing?
Doing okay.
Good. Thanks, Archbishop. As you mentioned, the church has got significant assets and wealth in Melbourne. But during the Royal Commission, the church warned that increasing compensation payments to abuse victims could lead to cuts to social programs. Are you prepared to be open about the value of assets the church has? And can the church afford to pay compensation anticipated under the redress scheme and also from the ending of the Ellis defence?
Okay. So, as I understand it here, the Ellis defence hasn't been used in the Archdiocese for many years. I've certainly never used it in my past, and I will not be using it. I will make myself available, personally, as the Archbishop of Melbourne, for a person to be sued. So I'm quite happy to say that publicly to you all now. The assets of the diocese I don't yet know. I'm only just starting to get a sense of where we are financially. it has been my practice in the past, and I can't see why I would change this into the future, that there might be ways in which an annual report is offered of the Archdiocese. It wouldn't be just financial, just like any company or government authority might have an annual report telling something of what have been the things and the works of that entity and what are the financial circumstances and other circumstances. So I'd need to work out how that can all happen. I don't know that yet. 3 weeks in, I'm not familiar with that. But that has been my practice, and I can't see a reason to change that.
Just following that up on that, when you talk about the annual report and disclosure, would that include the current day value of the assets of the church or their historic value? Because the information given to previous inquiries provided some would say a misleading
I
picture.
understand the point you're making.
Yeah.
It depends on the property, actually. So, for instance, school properties need to be valued in a particular way that is a requirement of the government, which is different from, say, commercial properties from which we receive some investment income and so on, which then enables us to not use God's people's money on the redress scheme and so on. So there's different ways in which property assets and generally other assets are measured. Now, I'm not an accountant and I don't know the law in all this regard. That's why we have people in our Archdiocese who can make sure that we're compliant with laws in that regard.
More questions from working journalists first. There are, yes, right behind you, Ben.
Royce Miller, also from The Age.
Hello, Royce.
Hi. So just following on from Ben's question about financial matters, do you agree that it's now time for reform so that, like other charities, the Catholic and other churches are now required to financially report to regulators like the Australian Charities and Not-for-Profit Commission? As you'll be aware, you're currently exempt from reporting.
Again, it depends on which particular entity we're talking about in the life of the church. If I can use the example of a parish. So parish, I was saying a little earlier on about the diversity of forms and structures within the life of the church. Here's an example of that. So a parish might have relatively small annual income and expenditure that is below the threshold that's required of the ACNC. So they don't need to, therefore, report to the ACNC. I don't have the authority to take the money of a parish. It has its own authority and jurisdiction. Well, now I can't see your face. Sorry. So again, it depends on the particular entity we're talking about. Schools certainly have requirements under the ACNC, and they're complied with in the appropriate sort of ways. I don't know. I haven't even asked myself this question yet, so I don't know in terms of the general assets of the Archdiocese. I don't know where we stand as the Archdiocese, so I can't answer that part of the question. But just trying to indicate that I will do what's required of me to comply with the expectations of the ACNC, and that's the key body at this stage by which those sort of judgments need to be made.
Just a follow-up question. It sounds to me that what you're saying is that the status quo is probably okay. The church actively fought against...
I don't know what the status quo here is yet.
Right, okay. Maybe something we can talk about further, but it's a matter that's up for review as we speak now. It's before the federal government. And a key question is the exemptions that are given to the Catholic and other churches and whether or not the churches should be more accountable.
Yeah. And other charities generally.
Well, not so much because the other charities actually financially report. The churches were carved out from reporting when the Act was decided in 2012.
In terms of details, I'm not able to go into those sort of answers because I don't know myself yet. So, but it's certainly something I can take on notice.
We'll follow it up.
Next question. Do we have another question? We'll start with Sam Donovan from the ABC, then move it around.
Hi, Archbishop. Thanks for coming to speak to us today. I'm Samantha Donovan from
Samantha.
the ABC. Archbishop, at the Royal Commission, just getting back to confession, there was a bit of a grey area raised, and the Royal Commission has asked the Bishops' Conference to go to Rome and get clarification on this. And I was a bit surprised at the hearing that the 5 archbishops who gave evidence didn't have a firm view on it. They had differing opinions. And that is, what is the situation at confession when a child is at confession and reveals that they are being sexually abused? And there was an argument put at the Commission that because they're not the penitent, they're not confessing to a sin, that the seal of the confession wouldn't apply. And your predecessor, Archbishop Hart, said no, he wouldn't break the seal of the confession to take it to the police. But Archbishop Coleridge, who's now leading the Bishops' Conference, said that maybe he would, and Archbishop Wilson was also of the same view that perhaps he would. What are your thoughts on that? If a child came to you and perhaps not understanding what is being done to them and you realised that they were being abused by someone, would you break the seal of the confession to take that to the police?
Could I start with that broader aspect that you were talking about and where we're at with what constitutes a seal? That's kind of the heart of the question that you're getting at. What actually is constituting the seal part? And that's the question that we were asked to take to Rome. It's worth noting that, in a sense, that question's never been asked in the life of the Church before. The appallingness of what has happened over these last 40, 50, 60 years in terms of our Australian context has raised this now as a question that needs to be asked for the whole world, in fact, for every country. So we did this long before the actual recommendations came out. I think it was early in 2017 that the Bishops' Conference wrote to Rome about this. Yes, we have not received an answer yet. I acknowledge that. But there is this difficult question as to what actually constitutes the seal. In the terms of the child's circumstance, can I tell you how I would operate in this regard? So this is making use of good pastoral practice. So if a child came to me and indicated that they had been abused, I would immediately take the child outside of the confession itself. So I'd give them absolution for whatever sins they committed. That's not a sin, of course. But if they have committed something that was, yes, I'll give them absolution and then ask them and talk with them a little bit about the matter that they've raised with me and ask them if we can talk a little bit further about that. What steps can I take to help you to get to safety? So all of those things are outside of the seal, and that's how I'd handle it myself.
Thank you.
Yes, next question to just behind Sam.
Hi, Megan Neal from AAP. The Bishops' Conference is about to release its response to the Royal Commission recommendations. Can you give us an idea of what actions we can expect from the Church and what you will be doing, both to protect children going forward and to deal with survivors who have previously been abused?
Yeah. So yes, for those who are not aware, tomorrow the national response of the Catholic Church to the recommendations of the Royal Commission will be released. I'm not going to, that's its own particular thing tomorrow, so I'll leave that for itself. What am I doing? The very first thing I'm doing is learning what we're doing here in Melbourne. So what are the practices already in place in Melbourne? You may be familiar, well, I'm sure you are familiar with, there's currently 2 pathways of redress. A third is starting up now. The 2 pathways at the moment are the Melbourne response and civil litigation. The third being the new National Redress Scheme. So in terms of responding to victim survivors who have come forward, there's those pathways at the moment. The Melbourne response one, I've already said this publicly elsewhere, both the Melbourne response and the one I'm being familiar with, Towards Healing in New South Wales, or the rest of the country, both of those I think will come to a completion, and a new third pathway I think will need to be worked through. And there's already been a commitment of the bishops to develop that, and we're asking external we're consulting with external people to help us develop that, including some victim groups. I don't know what that's going to be yet, but it won't be Melbourne response, and it won't be Towards Healing, and it'll be essentially capturing those who might not want to go down the path of the National Redress Scheme, nor want to go down the path of civil litigation. It will capture those who are vulnerable adults and have been abused in some way that is not a criminal matter. So there are various needs for this third way that's being developed. That's, I think, what I can say at the moment.
A question at the back.
Sorry,
there
there was a little bit else you asked in your question. I've just forgotten what it was.
Also, what's being done to protect children now, safeguarding measures?
Yep. So here in the Arch, again, I'm 3 weeks in, so I don't know everything yet. It'll take me a little while to learn all this. But in March this year, the Archdiocese of Melbourne established a professional standards unit, which is up and running and dealing with the various matters, particularly in terms of the Commission for Children and Young People here in Victoria and the compliance around those sort of requirements. We have CareLink, which has been in existence for, I gather, for some considerable time, but was significantly reformed not too long ago. I don't know the exact dates around these things yet, but significantly reformed. So there is an agency separate from the Archdiocese that where those who have been abused can go to, where families can go to, secondary victims, and as an agency that can support by referring to psychologists, spiritual counsellors, other supportive opportunities for victims or survivors and secondary people who have been harmed in all of this. So that's up and running, and I gather going very well. How do I know if it's going very well? I've spoken to a few people who are making use of the service already, and they've spoken well of that. There might be different views around that I haven't yet heard, but at this stage, I'm hearing that CareLink these days is a rather good service in the counselling and supporting and offering other means of support to victim survivors and so on. Of course, we're complying with the Commission for Children and Young People, working towards the implementation of that. It's not fully implemented now, but it's on the way, just as the actual CCYP itself is still working around the details of how this all applies, not only for the Catholic Church but everyone else. We've established a direct consultation reference group with the CCYP so that we can make this journey together. So there's a few. There's others, but there's a few.
A question at the back there.
Luke Enriquez Gomes from The Guardian.
I can't see.
Hello.
Hello. What's your name?
Luke Enriquez Gomes from The Guardian. Thank you for your speech, Archbishop. Just wanted to briefly take you down a different tact. The Anglican Church in Melbourne has been quite vocal about the debate that's going on about African gangs in this state, which I'm sure... About? African gangs, which I'm sure you're aware of in this state. I wondered whether you had similar concerns to your Anglican colleagues about the debate that's happening and the impact it might be having on the South Sudanese community in Melbourne?
I have no idea what the Anglicans have said about this. I can't comment on their circumstances. I've been down to Laverton area already in our archdiocese, down in, what's it called? Oh, I'm still trying to remember names. Something Meadows, what was it?
Broadmeadows?
No, Altona Meadows. Altona Meadows. Got a lot of places to learn. Where I've already met up with some of the South Sudanese community. We have one of our deacons, permanent deacons in the Catholic Church who's South Sudanese. We have what they call a catechist, which is a fairly senior leader within the community. And already I'm seeing that there are, great sort of ways in which the community has been engaged and which I would strongly support. Our Catholic Care has a number of programs in existence. I don't know the details of them, but I've been told that we have a number of programs of outreach with various refugee and migrant communities and helping them through the sorts of traumas that they often bring with them in settling into a new country, both those who have come directly from oppressive and war-torn and other oppressive realities. So in all of that, what I'm trying to say is that we need to walk with our communities, all our communities. And we find ways where there's difficulties to work with them in overcoming those difficulties.
Okay, any more journalists' questions? I'll get to you in a second, Judy. Farah, yeah.
Hi, Farah Thomason from The Age. Farah.
Hi, Farah.
Hi. Much has been said through the Royal Commission about the abuse of children by priests, but I think perhaps one thing that hasn't been discussed as much is the abuse by priests of vulnerable women and adults generally. To what extent do you believe this is a problem the Church must confront?
This was quite a significant debate in New South Wales recently. I don't know if it was an issue down here too in Victoria. I don't know. Oh, I can't hear you. Sorry. Anyway, so you might be aware of the program that Julia, what's her surname?
Which
Works
Julia?
with the drum.
Oh, Julie Baird.
Julie Baird and another sociologist did in this area, and looking initially at the question of domestic abuse and then seeing where that played out in terms of church workers and particularly clergy and so on. You may remember that she did it initially on the Anglican situation and then did something in terms of the Catholic situation. Which is a bit more narrow than what you're asking, isn't it? I'll get to where you're going. So just noting that sort of, that's something of where I'm coming from. I don't know the circumstances here yet, so it's a bit hard for me to answer other than in relatively general terms, so I'll do that. There are significant questions to be asked of all of us who are leaders in the Church in our relationships with everyone, male or female, religious or laity, and so on. So I think my kind of general approach in this is that I need to be offering good professional development for our clergy as an ongoing basis. I understand that there are already programs in place in that regard. There's certainly policies in terms of behaviour that are exercised and the priests are held accountable to. But there is a general question about how our priests are learning to relate professionally as public ministers with women and men, religious and lay people. I'm not able to offer much more at the moment, more than that general, because I just don't know the circumstances here yet.
Yeah, down the back.
Hello, Archbishop. Paul Dowsley from 7 News.
Well, hello.
Hello.
I can barely see down to that.
Question in 2 parts. Firstly, have you spoken to any of the Victorian victims, and I know it's only 3 weeks in, but what was your message or would be your message to them? And if any of these clerical abusers sought your forgiveness, would you give it?
Absolutely yes. To the forgiveness, absolutely. And not just the forgiveness, then I'll see what we can do in terms of the action that needs to go with that forgiveness. So, absolute commitment. And in fact, if there are any of you who know victims who might want to speak with me, I will make myself available. In terms of the first part of your question, yes, I already have. I'm not going to go into details, of course. They were private conversations that I had actually before I was installed. A few days before, when I first arrived in Melbourne, I had the opportunity to meet up with some victims or survivors for some conversation, and I also met with some of the survivor groups. So I've done that already. I've met a few other victims, survivors since then. That will be something of a pattern of mine as people might want to speak with me.
What was your message to them?
I hear you. I believe you. What can I do?
Thank you.
We've got any more journalist questions? Otherwise, to others, please, by all means, ask a question, but identify yourself if you can. Judy.
Thank you. Your Grace.
What's your name?
My name is Dr. Judy Corton.
Hello, Judy.
Hi. I'm a lawyer, an advocate, representing victims of institutional abuse. In particular, I represent Mrs. Eileen Piper, who is with me today.
Hi.
Mrs. Piper is 93 years of age and continues her 25-year quest for justice for herself and her daughter Stephanie, who killed herself in January 1994 when she was 32 years old. There is a question here, but I ask for 2 minutes to give the requisite context.
Yeah, just make the statement as brief as you can, then get to the question, Judy.
Before her death, Stephanie reported to church authorities that she had been sexually assaulted and raped as a teenager by Father Mulvale, a Palatine priest working in the Archdiocese of Melbourne. Stephanie was told, though, the alleged sex crimes never happened and that basically she was a liar. Stephanie then reported to the police. Following her report to the police, Stephanie was threatened. Untruths were manufactured, seriously tarnishing her character. Or, using the present-day vernacular, there was victim blaming and slut shaming. Stephanie could cope no longer. Mrs. Piper has brought along a photograph of Stephanie in her coffin, and she would like your Grace to see this and to see what the church ultimately drove her daughter to do. We'll talk about that. Yeah. Thank you, Your Grace. Thank you. So Mrs. Piper is here today to continue her courageous battle for truth and justice. The decision makers over the years, however, that is the Archdiocese of Melbourne, Mr. O'Callaghan QC of the Melbourne Response, and the Palatines, have responded to Mrs. Piper with cold-heartedness, denials, hostility, enmity and rancour, and disturbingly relied upon the clinical and unreachable black letter of the law. Your Grace, you have reached out, as you've told us already, to victims and their families with your words of compassion and understanding. You've pledged to improve the transparency, compassion and accountability within the Archdiocese. This provides great succour for my client, Mrs. Piper. Your Grace, this is Stephanie Piper's Me Too moment. This is 93-year-old Eileen Piper's Me Too moment. Please, Your Grace, make it your moment and rectify the great wrong done here to Stephanie and Eileen Piper by the Catholic Church, and all in the name of Jesus. Will your Grace please receive a dossier that we have here and make a public commitment today to personally read these documents, meet with Mrs. Piper, and then take the requisite action to finally bring an end to the horror and, just as Jesus would do, allow the truth to be revealed and proper justice delivered.
I just said to you, Eileen, I'd be happy to meet with you. I'd be happy to read what you would like to give to me. I then need to consider with the circumstances of whatever has gone before. I don't know. Unfortunately, I don't know all those details. But once I've been able to ascertain that, I can see where I need to go from there. So, yes, Eileen, I'd like to be able to meet with you. I can read this that you've given to me, but then I need to consider what has your own circumstances and the circumstances of what happened to Stephanie, and then I'll be able to respond further.
Okay, we've got time for a few more questions. I know we've got one down here. There's a microphone. Anna, if you could come up to Kathy, then we'll get to you, Josephine, and Johan here. Yeah.
Hello, Grace. Kathy Boland
Hello,
here.
Kathy. Can I... you don't need to call me Your Grace. I'm happy with something like Archbishop Peter or, in whatever.
Terrific. I
Sorry.
just wanted to change tack a little, and I wondered whether you're going to address some of the governance structure within the Archdiocese. I was talking to some people at a function last night, and they had a lot of questions for you regarding that. Currently, there's no representation from parishioners at the structural level, and I wondered whether you have, or whether you see a formal role for laity in any of the governance of the church within Victoria, and also will you see a leadership role for women within the church, and if so, when would we be hearing those?
Okay. Again, can I answer this relatively generally, because I still need to learn a fair bit about this. I might do it by how I've approached things in the past, and that might be something of a learning for me into the future. So I've come from a diocese, it's about a fourth of the size, so about 250,000 Catholics to now 1.1 or 1.2 million. It's a smaller reality, but enough of a sort of a size to be significant as an archdiocese. Wasn't an archdiocese, it was a diocese. So in that circumstances, most of my key leaders were women, including the priests. So if I included all the priests and included all the principals and my immediate team of 5 or 6, there were more women leaders making governance decisions. I can't see why that can't continue in terms of how I operate here in Melbourne. I can't just make those sort of... I don't know if it is the case here yet, I don't know that, but I can't make wholesale changes immediately. There's people's lives and employments and all that sort of stuff. But certainly as opportunity arises, it's just a normal thing that I involve whoever's a good leader. I don't care if they're male or female. If we get a good leader, I need to hear those voices. So that's kind of how I approach things. Yeah, probably that's enough at the moment. Yeah.
Josephine.
Sorry.
Yeah, go on.
You did start with governance structures. Yes, I need to look at the governance structures here, and I will be doing that. I've already started doing that, in particular around the safeguarding side of things. I need to do it in terms of other areas as well.
Thank you. Thank you for your speech.
Where
Here I
am
am.
Oh, hello.
Archbishop, thank you for your speech. Josephine Cafagna is my name. A related question to the one that was just asked. Can I have your personal view about the ordination of women in the Catholic Church? Do you ever see that happening? And secondly, how senior a role can women have in the Church if they're not ordained?
Okay. I personally am a son of the Church, so ordination for women to the priesthood has been something that's already been ruled out by our current Pope and previous popes, and I support that. So there's that position. Now I think it's a different question altogether about governance and how we go about ensuring good governance structures within the Church that is hearing from and led by both women and men, both ordained and non-ordained. That has been my practice. To use the example of where I came from, the head of Catholic Care, which was a very big organisation in Archdiocese of, the Diocese of Broken Bay. I keep promoting it. Is a woman. The head of the finance, property and so on side of things is a woman. Head of safeguarding is a woman. There's 3 of my 6 primary advisors, and we would work together, meeting very regularly, and we would be making decisions together. I don't know in terms of here yet, and I don't know what might be possible, but that's been my practice, and I will endeavour to continue in that way.
Got time for 2 more quick questions. We'll go to you, Johan, then finally down the end of the room there.
Thank you. Thanks for your speech, Archbishop. Johan Lidberg, Monash University. So there's a bit of an elephant in the room. There's actually many elephants, but there's one that we can address, and that is the issue of trust. And as you know, media and journalism operate a lot on trust, and so does the Church. So you've outlined here the redress scheme and hearing and seeing the victims and compensating and so on, but all beyond that, the breach of trust is monumental, you would agree. And I heard a discussion between 2 Vatican observers the other day that claimed that it's the biggest challenge to the Catholic Church since 1517. That puts it into perspective. So this issue...
I would agree with that, actually.
Yeah, so that's 500 years, that's a long time.
Yeah, I know.
So with this issue of trust, how do you come back from this? What is the strategy? And this is global, not only Melbourne, but maybe you can start in Melbourne and then perhaps go global. Thank you.
I might leave the global to one side. How do you start building trust? By becoming trustworthy. You don't go and build trust by going out and saying, trust me. You do it by your own personal actions that might show that I might be able to build trust from myself outwards. It struck me over these last number of years that here I'm going to speak very much from that. Remember I was talking about I come from a different perspective. Here I want to talk from that perspective. I see my life as being very much standing at the foot of the cross for the next how many years the Lord gives me to live. That's where I need to be. And if I'm not there, call me back on it.
And final question is Chrissy Foster at the back of the room.
Oh, hello, Chrissy.
Hello. I've been fighting the issue of child sexual assault in the Catholic Church for over 22 years now. 8 years ago, I wrote a book with Paul Kennedy called Hell on the Way to Heaven, and I want to know if you will read it, please.
I've read some of it already, not all of it, but I'd be happy enough to read it, yes. With my slight hesitation simply being that I don't read too fast. So I'm certainly open to being able to read your book.
Well, I think you need to, because it's all about your predecessors.
Okay.
And what your church did to children and victims since then. You really need to read it and take note and act differently if you want your church to move ahead.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks, Chrissy.
Thank you, Chrissy. Thank you, everybody. And thank, please, Archbishop Peter Comensoli. I've been to a lot of press club lunches. I've hosted a lot of press club lunches, but I don't think I've ever experienced a press club lunch like that. In all honesty, I thank you again, Archbishop, for being candid in your answers. Not necessarily the answers some people wanted to hear, but as I said, it's a testament to your courage as a senior church figure to come into a press club full of journalists and take on issues given all the negative and justifiably negative press the Catholic Church has got over the past few years. I just want to ask you one very quick question before you go. Can you please explain the thought process behind choosing Essendon as your football team? And be honest.
I'm a classy lad. So, how did it happen? Here's something. Who's from New South Wales originally, here in the room? Okay, so us New South Welsh people are used to, when you're talking about the footy, and for us it's rugby league, you ask someone what team you go for. You start off a conversation, oh, who do you go for? And then you get it going. Victorians, you start with, you must go for. And then you go immediately to, and you must not go for some other team. So the only, in all of these, I got sways of people telling me what team I should go for. I know nothing about AFL, I quite readily admit that. But the only team that no one told me not to go for was Essendon.
You're speaking to the wrong people, clearly.
And then I learned about the drug scandals, and I'm into redemption. And maybe Essendon's into redemption as well. There you go.
Thank you, and apologies to any Bombers fans in the audience. Ladies and gentlemen, please thank again Archbishop Peter Comensoli.